Hello, everybody. I just wanted to take a quick minute before I start my actual in-service to thank you for being here. And look at the background. You can't see my earrings with this background. But anyway, this background is actually the virtual classroom that I had used during all of this COVID time with my students, and it just makes me feel really good. Reminds me of my family room growing up. All right, so let's get into the real stuff, of which you're going to see how slow I am with this. Okay, so I'm going to do my screen, get rid of this. And let me start the presentation. I'm doing it through PDF in hopes that the Wi-Fi holds out. I'm in the country today. Come on now. Okay. So here to start, my name is Jeannie Henriquez. I'm a bilingual speech-language pathologist. I've actually been working with bilingual preschoolers in Wilmington, Delaware for 8 years. It's been wonderful work. At this point in time, I'm a student through Teachers College, Columbia University. I am taking the Bilingual Extension Institute, which is basically 6 graduate credits on top of my master's degree already to obtain an advanced certificate in bilingual speech-language pathology. This particular presentation is really geared towards those who are interested in becoming a speech pathologist. Maybe they're in high school right now looking at what programs to go into for undergrad. It's also a time for those folks who are really starting their journey to know that you can become a bilingual speech-language pathologist and kind of how to go about that. We need them, so please consider, please. But it's also a time for those who maybe are considering, they're in undergrad in communication disorders and they're considering what grad school program they want to go to. There are some options there. It's also meant for those who are already speech-language pathologists with a master's degree who maybe want to have an idea of how to go about being a bilingual SLP depending on their state rules. So hopefully this applies to one of you and it can be informative. This has been a wild ride. I'm closing up my coursework now with this presentation. And please let me know if you have any questions. My email is there. My phone number is there, so you can send me a text as well, and I'll respond as soon as I can. Okay, so who am I, right? Some of you already know who I am, some of you don't, but on the surface and on paper, look at me, this is me, and that's my picture. You know that I'm a lady, you know that I have tan skin, I've got brown eyes, fine dark hair. My last name is Henriquez, or some people say Enriquez. I grew up in New York's Hudson Valley. I do speak Spanish, and I went to SUNY colleges for undergrad and grad school, New Paltz and Plattsburgh. So you can drum up some of the assumptions that you have of who I am. You already know I'm a bilingual SLP. And I'm going to blow your mind. What? I am not Hispanic. I'm actually biracial. And I find it really interesting because there's a lot of assumptions that we make with the clients with whom we work with. Sometimes we make assumptions and they're right, and for a lot of the time they're wrong. So we really need to connect with our clients. We really need to get some background history, understand where they stand, maybe their preferences even. For me, you could make the assumption that I'm Hispanic, but in reality, I'm biracial. I'm Jamaican, Scotch Irish. My last name is Enriquez with an S, which is actually Portuguese. And then of course my dad was adopted, so it's not even my real last name. There's no blood tie to that. My real last name would be Hall, which is not as fun. And nobody in my family speaks Spanish. I actually had to learn that by coursework and from the conversational piece, living abroad. So it's a different story on my end, not exactly what you would think, but again, keep in mind with anybody you're working with that you have to ask them and you have to get the information before you make assumptions. This is interesting, looking at the ASHA membership and kind of figuring out, where do I stand? I am a multiracial babe. Where do I stand in the ASHA membership? How many other people are like me or identify as multiracial? And you can see here, I don't know, can I use the cursor? This is going to be confusing for everybody, but multiracial in that top chart there on the right-hand side says 1.4%. 1.4% of the entire ASHA membership across this great country of the United States considers themselves multiracial. I'm not really represented in the entire ASHA membership, which is interesting. I stand kind of alone and I enjoy it. But what about me as a bilingual SLP? Right, so there's that bilingual service provider. As an ASHA member, you can go on and claim whether you're a bilingual service provider or not. And I kind of want to see how many people are like me out there. Well, first of all, there's the definition. There's an ASHA standard for bilingual service providers. Audiologists or SLPs who present themselves as bilingual. It could be anything. For me, it happens to be English and Spanish. For the purposes of providing clinical services, must be able to speak their primary language, which for me is English, and speak or sign at least one other language, which for me is Spanish. Here's the clincher: with native or near native proficiency in, and they have all the big words, but I'll just summarize: vocab, meaning, pronunciation, grammar, use of language during clinical management. That's a huge snag for folks. You know, we are, as SLPs, as speech language pathologists, the language, like we are the language superheroes. If you're claiming that you have the ability in a foreign language or a second language or third or fourth or fifth, you have to be able to be either native or near native in your abilities in order to teach that language to another person, which is the entirety of our job pretty much. So that's an important clincher there. But then when you look at the bilingual service provider breakdown in terms of the entirety of the ASHA membership, only, let me see here, where does it say? Only 8% of the ASHA membership stated that they're bilingual service providers. That's across the board. That is not just English and Spanish. That is any language. And so if you think about those who are like me, it's even less. But man, we have a lot of bilingual students and dual language learners in our schools. The chances of us having dual language learners on our caseload is quite high. But I do want to say that I had done a similar presentation the year before during COVID, and the numbers jumped from 6.5% to 8%. So that is pretty cool. I have to say, I'm super pleased that there are more bilingual service providers out there, but we still need a whole lot more. I encourage you to look into this. Study abroad, do what you can to really get those abilities up so that you can work with the most amazing clients ever. Okay. So on this page, it says, what are the benefits of bilingual service delivery in the world of speech language pathology? And this image on the right-hand side discusses total US residents who speak a non-English language in their home. In 2010, 59.5 million people spoke something other than English in their home. That's a ton of folks. So just for your knowledge, you're needed. 100% job placement if you're a bilingual service delivery provider, yeah. So basically some of the perks for the client, but also for the SLP, is that you're advocating for this historically underserved community and you're serving them, you're helping them through it. And that's just, it's an amazing feeling, something that I've definitely enjoyed for my 8 years and something I want everybody to experience. You're connecting with them, you're educating them, and you're doing it directly in the language that they speak, which is super important for them. You're providing assessment in both of their languages if they're bilingual. You're providing treatment in both of their languages. You're considering both of their languages when you're considering whether they need special education services or not, right? That's very important. You're a community resource for them. I mean, I can't even tell you how many texts and phone calls that I get from the families that I work with because they say, hey, I'm trying to reach my son or daughter's school. I don't speak English. The only person picking up the phone is speaking English. Can you help me? And I'm always ready to do that because I feel like that's their right, and they need help, and that's kind of a closed door that we can help the community open, which is amazing. And then, of course, just on the SLP end, there's more opportunities for us to have extra employment. I mean, there's obviously a dearth of bilingual speech pathologists. So, you know, there's going to be opportunities for us to provide evaluations in different districts, evaluations in the community, or provide extra therapies outside of our work duties. So there are a lot of opportunities for growth here. Just FYI. How do you become a bilingual SLP. And that was really something again, I did a presentation that was kind of similar to this. And that was the question that came up at the end was like, but how do you do it, right? How do you do it? And we already know the ASHA standard for it, for your language abilities. It's got to be kind of up there. You have to consider your internal ethics when you're really coming through and claiming to be a bilingual SLP. Doesn't mean you can't do it. Look at me. I mean, I literally had no background in Spanish, and I'm a bilingual SLP right now. So basically what you need to be a practicing SLP is a master's degree. No matter what, you have to have a master's degree to be a practicing SLP within the schools or in the medical setting. So in order to do this bilingual speech pathology route, there's a couple of things that you could do. You could get an undergraduate degree in communication disorders and sciences, which is usually like 4 years. Then you can apply to a grad school. Cool. Or you could do one of those 5-year undergrad and grad accelerated programs in speech pathology, where upon graduation you have a bachelor's and a master's, which is really cool. But there's like, I don't know that there's like any delineation within your years, like when you get one or the other, but at the close of 5 years, you get both. Misericordia University is an example of that, as well as Duquesne. They have that accelerated program. Or you could go the route that I went, which is a little bit longer. You could have an undergraduate degree in another area of study, which for me was accounting. So that was 4 years. And then because I didn't have those kind of basic skills and knowledge in communication disorders, then you apply to a post-baccalaureate certificate program in communication disorders, which is a year or more. I say like more because it included some summers with that. And then I was able to apply for a grad program in speech pathology, and that was another 2 years. So in total, that was like 7 years. It's not quite the best option, but for those of you who have a different career already and are switching in, please know that this is totally attainable. You can totally do this, and it's a wonderful career. I have never once regretted my decision to do that. So then once you have that master's degree, you can then, if you want to pursue becoming a bilingual speech pathologist, and you notice that your state requirements may require a bilingual extension, you can then apply for a bilingual extension similar to what I have done and get those 6 extra grad level credits in bilingual speech language pathology. And there are multiple programs. I did it through Teachers College Columbia. And then once you're done there, you have the ability to be a bilingual SLP. Now, like I told you, I'm taking this course now, but I have been a bilingual SLP in the state of Delaware for 8 years. It really does depend on the state in which you work, whether all of this is a requirement or not. Really, the requirement for me in Delaware is that I am bilingual and I am a master's level speech language pathologist. However, in my home state of New York, the bilingual extension is a requirement, and a test called the BEA, the Bilingual Education Assessment, which basically proves your proficiency in both of the languages that you're claiming. So for me, it was English and Spanish, and they assessed my English abilities and my Spanish abilities, and I passed it, which is awesome. But it just depends on the state that you're in, the type of program you might need to go into. Now, if you're at the level where you're in undergrad right now and you're considering grad programs, you can actually find, and if you do some research, you can find programs that already have an incorporated emphasis in bilingual speech language pathology, which is super cool. When I was looking at programs, that wasn't even a part of my mind. I was not interested in that. I was going to work with adults anyway, and I just wasn't really focused on that. But there are programs, for example, Texas Christian University, that provides a grad program that includes the emphasis in bilingual speech language pathology. So upon graduation, you are a bilingual SLP, and that's amazing. So those are some of your options that you have. Really wish you luck if you're looking into it. And again, if you have any questions at all, you can reach out to me. But it is attainable, which is great. So what can be expected in a bilingual SLP or emphasis extension program? And at this point, I'm not seeing the video that normally is here in the corner, but I have a video here that shows basically the Columbia University Bilingual Extension Institute home video. And what that is this is the course I'm doing. It's 3 credits of preschool bilingual SLP. It's 3 credits of school age bilingual SLP. 50 hours of bilingual speech language pathology clinical practice, which I've been doing on my job daily. And that's, overseen by an SLP mentor that's been assigned to me. And then of course you have learning outcomes that are related to assessment, which was the real reason that I got into this, and also the treatment of bilingual children. And it's across a variety of diagnoses and severities. And of course, cultural and linguistic backgrounds. This program, even though I am a bilingual English-Spanish SLP, this program was not designed just for English and Spanish. This was for all languages and cultural backgrounds. Oh, there it is. I guess it's doing some delayed stuff on me. Well, that's silly. Anyway, all right. So what did I learn about bilingual speech language pathology in my bilingual extension that complemented my prior knowledge? Because I went to grad school in SUNY Plattsburgh, and that was an amazing program. I think that it did a wonderful job of kind of prepping me to be a successful bilingual SLP upon entry into this field. Again, there were some things that I didn't know, because it wasn't a specific bilingual program, but they did an amazing job. So I don't want to say, what didn't I get in grad school? Because that is not the case. What complemented my prior knowledge from grad school, right? And I have a little mind-blowing thing here. Well, there's a new topic that's on a lot of people's minds that is cultural competence and humility. And actually, ASHA does have a stance that we all need to be culturally competent in our work, and we need to be accepting of other cultures and diversity, which is obviously necessary. So one of the things that I want to bring to your attention that doesn't always come up, it's not something you immediately think of, but when you're working with children that are exposed to two languages, they're actually bicultural as well. They're not just bilingual, they're bicultural. We need to consider that. Their social language may not be the same as what we identify with where we are in the United States. Their culture and language use is going to be dynamic, meaning that it's always going to be changing. It is not static. So we need to keep up with our kids and see where they stand. A lot of them will pick up some of the culture that we have, but remain with a little bit of the home culture as well. And we need to be accepting of that and work with it and utilize that to all of our benefit. Why is it important to be aware of their culture when it does not match the culture that they're in right now? And that's a cool one, because I am a school-based bilingual speech language pathologist, meaning I am here for the academic success of my students. That has nothing to do with their home. I am here for the academic success of our students. And, you can have a pretty conservative mindset with that, but the truth of the matter is that the way we're brought up in Western culture is so different from other cultures out there. Even down to our linguistic development. Our parents are listening to our coos and our goos as babies, and they're considering those, conversation turn-taking events. And in many other cultures, that's just a baby saying stuff, right? So we have very different expectations. And as you age, then parents are like, ooh, what's this? What's this? What's this? Constantly quizzing, constantly working towards labeling objects and actions and things of that nature to get them ready for school. That's just a Western idea. But that's not the idea of development for a lot of other cultures. And verbal participation expectations may be different because of their cultural background. And what's really cool is we have a textbook, and I don't know if you can see this in the little, oh no, it's hidden, little chiclet. Oh my gosh. Well, this book is called Dual Language Development and Disorders. It's a handbook on bilingualism and second language learning, and it's done by Paradis, Gene C, or it could be Genesee, I hope I'm not saying it wrong, and Crago. And this particular textbook was something that we used in our coursework that was really amazing. And within that textbook on page 45, it talked about Inuit children who went into a Western classroom in Canada and how that went. So the Inuit children, in their culture and in their academic environment, it is completely acceptable to call out the answers to any questions as they know it and in unison. Just anybody who knew it can call it out. That is not acceptable in a Western classroom. We're always talking about raise a quiet hand, and all the silliness. So for them, that's hard because they're literally getting punished for something that is accepted in their home culture and classroom environment. On the flip side of that, then the teacher goes and points on them and says, hey, it's your turn to answer this question, individually testing and assessing their abilities, which is equally as traumatic. So just a little bit of knowledge, just that research that we're doing to be culturally humble and competent can help students more seamlessly blend in with their new environment, accepting and really, allowing them to flourish in whatever way they need, but not making it a traumatic experience and ruining all education for them from there forward. So the idea of competence is like full understanding, which at this point in recent years, we realize that's really not the term that we need to use, because whoever has full understanding, everybody is changing. I'm changing. My culture from back home is changed because I'm living in Delaware now. I was living in Philly for 6 years prior to this. My culture is constantly changing. So I can't expect a teacher or anybody to be fully competent on my cultural experiences. So competence is kind of out the window, and we like to focus more on cultural humility, which is basically that alliance of me saying, hey, I am ready and willing to continue studying and continue learning with you so that you have the best outcomes possible, right? So that's the cultural humility piece. But also with that, we need to consider then also the fact that they're dual language learners, and there may be some cross-linguistic influence. And I got to turn this phone off. It's buzzing all over the place. Anyway, so there might be some cross-linguistic influence in their communication and their language. And what does that look like? A perfect example is, a child whose home language is Spanish and they're just dropped into an all English environment and they're trying to mess around with their, language systems, and they say, the house blue. Cool, I guess. We would mark that wrong, be like, oh, they need speech. Any teacher would be like, they need speech and they need language therapy. Everything is wrong with that sentence, right? Because the word order is not correct. In English, the word order is subject, verb, object, and it is pretty solid. It really doesn't change from that. But in Spanish, it is pretty fluid. For them, they say, la casa azulada. Now I forget what example I said, but the house blue would be la casa azulada, which means that the adjective of the house, azul, the color, azulada, is at the end, right? So that's not subject, verb, object, right? And so it kind of changes things a little bit. Now, are we going to mark it wrong and say they need special education services? Not really. If we have an understanding of their cultural and linguistic background, we can kind of determine, oh, that's a difference. That's not a disorder. They need more time learning English versus needing special education services for their language, okay? Same thing goes for shared speech sounds, which we'll get into a little bit later. So here are some documents. To the left, there's a document on some common language differences observed among Spanish speakers who are learning English. Again, the house blue is an example. Another example is, sometimes articles are omitted. So Papa is going to store, whereas in English we would say Papa is going to the store. So just those similar like language differences that you find all the time. That does not mean that they're disordered in their language. It just means they need to learn English a little bit more, maybe some ESL services along those lines. There are shared and unshared sounds within languages. So in Spanish, there are sounds that occur that don't occur in English. There are sounds in English that don't occur in Spanish. If a child is having trouble saying the V sound, like my brother's name is Everton and nobody is saying that right when they're speaking Spanish, they're saying Everton, they do a B for a V. Why is that? Is it because they're wrong? Is it because they need special education services? No, basically what it means is that the V sound does not exist in Spanish, meaning they're trying their hardest to come up with something similar within their phonemic repertoire. That's not in Spanish. They're trying, but it's not an error, it's a difference. Okay, so that's where we need to really beef up our cultural humility, sensitivity, all of these things, so that we know when a student really actually needs to be identified as requiring special education or related services. So, bilingualism in general. Let me take some water. Give me a sec. Whew. Bilingualism. I like this picture because it has this dude where in his head it's saying la manzana. That is like what he knows, la manzana, but he's saying apple. So clearly this friend is bilingual. And I do the same thing in my brain. As much as I'd love to say, oh, I speak Spanish, I know. Well, it's in my head in English first for the most part. There are actually some times when it's not and it's confusing, but normally for me, it would be apple and then la manzana would be coming out of my mouth. There are a couple of types of bilingualism that it's constantly shifting for my caseload, which I find really interesting. There's simultaneous bilingualism, which means that the student who's under age 3 is learning 2 languages at the same time. That is simultaneous bilingualism. Then there's sequential bilingualism, which is you learning another language after age 3. So I'm actually a sequential bilingual learner. And that means that I learned my Spanish, started in middle school, and then I solidified it later on through study abroad. So after age 3, so I'm a sequential bilingual. But I find it really interesting on my caseload. When I first started 8 years ago, I had sequential bilinguals on my caseload, with preschool being that they're already entering preschool age 3. I would have students who were monolingual Spanish speakers coming onto my caseload, and I'd be working with them, and then they would eventually acquire English through their academic setting, sequential bilingualism. But as the years have gone on, and a lot of families have been established in the Wilmington, Delaware area for a while, and their older siblings are now talking to them as they're growing and aging, and they're speaking to them in English, they are simultaneous bilingual learners. So it's kind of cool to see that shift within my own caseload over the years. We have to consider language dominance and preference changes that occur over time. This is a huge thing for my caseload. Sometimes, like I mentioned before, we start the year off all in Spanish. Mid-year, we're doing a little bit of both. And by the end of the year, man, they are taking off in English. Some, for the most part. Some kids are just like Spanish dominant, and that's how it goes. Other kids come in, I have no idea how, but they come in from an all Spanish speaking environment, speaking full English, which I find really interesting, but also at the same time, everybody's different. Everybody's preference is different. And we need to consider that as we go through and we're considering testing. Something that blew my mind for anybody who's watching that kind of has this, this background idea of bilingualism or works with bilingual SLPs. Oh my gosh, to be bilingual, it takes a lot of input and quality input. There's a study that was referenced in our textbook that said that Spanish and English bilingual children who received less than 25% of input in Spanish often did not become fluent Spanish speakers. And I kind of had that same problem. I was taking courses in Spanish and I was doing really well in reading and writing, but at the conversational level, I was trash. Why was that? It was because I really didn't have that input for a long period of the day. Well, then I went and I studied abroad, and guess what? Then that number went to like 100% exposure to Spanish during my day. And of course, then I became a fluent Spanish speaker. So it's really dependent, this bilingualism and this idea of maintaining bilingualism, it's important to have that language exposure, and not only just exposure, but good quality exposure to language to have a child maintain bilingualism. But then this was also like a mind-blowing fact that bilingualism is not a risk factor for language development. No, it doesn't confuse the child. It's so funny how many teachers I have. I work with a bunch of different teachers in Head Starts and in my program as well. And parents will come through and be like, well, I know we're like bilingual. I think it's confusing my child. No, it's not confusing your child. Your child has a language delay or disorder, and they just so happen to also have access to 2 languages. So it's not a risk factor to language development, and it does not confuse children. There's no research to show that. Again, the abilities of the child in language across the board is dependent completely on consistent quality exposure to language, in this case for bilinguals, both languages, okay? Here are some language considerations that we have. Well, code switching, right? That's a big term that we have that we all kind of understand, and that's when you're kind of using two languages within your communication. And there's a guy on Instagram, Jose Medina, and he says leveraging your linguistic repertoire, right? When you're communicating, that's code switching. But something that kind of was interesting for me was that in the research, it's actually code mixing for children. That's how they refer to it, code mixing. And then for adults, it's code switching. So that was kind of cool. If you're actually a nerd and reading, articles, which I had to do for this coursework, you're going to notice that difference. And I do like having that clearly defined. Now, code switching, I'll just do the broad term. Code switching is actually a very typical phenomenon with those who are learning another language. The catch, though, is that it should follow the grammar of the languages being used. If you're noticing code switching and it's kind of random and not following what would be expected for whatever languages they are bilingual in, then that might be a red flag for some language disorder. But if it follows the grammar, then that's fine. Like, I want tomar milk, right? I want to drink milk. So in that instance, I just kind of inserted another word, but it actually matched the grammar that's expected for Spanish. And it actually matched the grammar that's expected for English. So that's a-okay. That's when it's typical. It also provides access to the composite of that child or adult's language abilities, right? So if they find that, they're struggling to figure out a word, they're going to throw that out there. It's not that they're confused. It's not that they're confused. It's just that that's the language that they know and they're going to insert it in there. So I think they have some examples. Oh yeah, there's some examples below about that. So that's kind of a gap filling example, right? So you can have a whole sentence that you want to say, and this happens to me too as a bilingual learner, where I don't necessarily know the word that I'm trying to say. I may not know it yet. So I'm going to insert my English because I know that word in English, and I'm just going to throw it in there and hope to gloss over it. It also could be that I'm trying to say something and there's like no direct translation for what I'm trying to say in the other language, and then I'm going to throw my English in there. And then there's also the fact that you could be like quoting someone else, right? Like, so for example, if I'm ever talking about my dad, I'm not really ever going to, quote something that he said in Spanish. Like, I'm just going to quote what he said in English and then briefly explain it in Spanish, because I'm directly quoting him. So those are some instances of code switching that's totally typical. Again, it can happen within the utterance, kind of the example that I gave before, where I inserted a Spanish word into my utterance. It could be inter-utterance. It could be one of my utterances is in Spanish and one of my utterances is in English, inter-utterance. And then, of course, I could also just be using this just in general because I'm speaking with bilingual listeners. I think that's the coolest thing. And that's something of interest that you want to find out within, for your students or your clients. What's their community like? Are they using one language over another? Are they combining both because they're bilingual listeners? And this whole idea of code switching, so many times parents will be like, my child is confused, they're mixing their languages. And it's like, who's actually confused in that moment? Is it that the child's confused because they're using two languages to communicate, which is super amazing? Or is it the adult that only speaks one that's confused because they couldn't understand all of the language the child was using? So additional language considerations, which we kind of already touched on, are those language transfer and cross-linguistic influence instances, right? Where, that whole idea of like learning another language, you're kind of mixing it in and connecting it with both of your languages. And so down below, we have some examples. Like before, it was like the adjective is produced after the noun for Spanish speakers who are learning English. These are common differences. So figure out what kind of influence their first language might have on their second, figure out what's typical, and don't over-identify, don't over-refer based on a difference versus a disorder. The other thing is using no for negation in place of don't, right? So I no want eat. Yo no quiero comer. It makes total sense in Spanish, but doesn't really cross over well. But again, it's a difference because they're still learning English. So then we move on to, so we're done with that language piece. We move on to the speech sound production considerations that we have. Speech sound production, you could say articulation, you could say phonology as well in there. Really and truly, how I explain it to parents is a pronunciation, using speech sounds to create syllables, to create words, to create words in phrases, words in sentences, and words in conversation. Okay, so it's all based on these sounds that we string together. Like I said before, it's really important to utilize your knowledge of what are the speech sounds that are in English and what are the speech sounds that are in the other language. The best thing to do, especially in this program they taught us, was to use these circles. Again, I don't know if you can see my cursor. The circles right in the center of this presentation right now. Use the circles. What are the sounds that are specific to whatever language their home language is? What are the sounds that are shared in the center? What are the sounds that are specific to English? And that way you can understand, okay, now if they got sounds wrong that are shared between the two languages, that's a red flag. Because it's not that they haven't been exposed to those sounds to be able to kind of generalize that or transfer that to English. That might be an area of need for therapy. But if they're making errored sounds on something that's specific to English, but not their home language, it's an exposure issue. They haven't been exposed to those sounds long enough to know how to necessarily create them. Now, some people are really good at that, like that's their skill. They're really good at pronunciation, and you're going to see that every child is different. Every person's different. I happen to be really good with the pronunciation. That's just an area of strength. So I would probably be able to get it, but not everybody's going to do that. And you can't say they need special education or related services based on that, because that's exposure. So on this page as well, I have some of the differences between expectations of when sounds are mastered. Okay, there's fewer consonant speech sounds in Spanish than there are in English. A lot of them develop kind of early on in Spanish, and you can see age 3, b, p. Age 4, what's expected. Age 5, what's expected. 6, 7. And go through, and then of course just keep track. Your child is bilingual, and their bilingualism is going to change all over the place. Keep track of the two languages and see how they're doing, always assessing both. Look at their speech intelligibility. Doesn't matter what language they're speaking, they should be intelligible by 3 years of age, about 75% of the time to an unfamiliar listener. So like an examiner, like if I were doing an assessment, that would be me, a new classroom teacher. But they should be about 100% intelligible by 3 to 4 years old in their family. That's a really good judge. If at home you're talking to the parents and they're like, hey, I just don't understand a lot of what my own child is saying. Like having them request their wants and needs is really hard for me to understand. Well, it doesn't matter what language you're speaking, the intelligibility expectations are the same. We're going to look at that and see how do they do in English versus Spanish. If their intelligibility is low in both, we're going to treat. Just some speech sound production considerations that we have that we throw out here. And let me know if you have any questions about that. But it's super cool, kind of like mixing the two and figuring out what targets and just making sure we're not over-identifying kids. So then the assessment considerations. This was like what I joined this whole cohort, the online cohort of this Bilingual Extension Institute for. It was still in 2021. It was like January of 2021. And I had been doing a string of evaluations for my employer with other districts. And, I was in consultation with one of my dear friends and colleagues who we were talking about some of the testing and assessment procedures that we have, and they didn't line up. And I was like, this is just insane. What? Like, they don't line up. We don't have very many bilingual assessments at our fingertips. There's like nothing. English assessments, standardized scores. There's so many different tests that you can use. But for actual bilingual kids, and by that, I'm focusing on English and Spanish, forget about other languages. The tests are not out there for us to use. And it's so sickening because many districts are like, well, we need a standard score. How can you give a standard score when there really aren't tests out there that are normed or created for bilingual children or adults? That is really hard. So a lot of the practices that I was doing didn't match the practices of my coworker. So then we had pretty much all of the state of Delaware bilingual SLPs. At the time, it was like 13. Like there's only 3 counties in Delaware. It's not a big state at all. We all got together via Zoom, and everybody was doing it differently. And when you really look at it, none of us were doing it actually right. And when that came to my mind, I was like, this is ridiculous. I am so frustrated that we provide these really long assessments. Sometimes they take like 2 hours. And then, of course, you're writing about 2 different languages. So you're talking about sick amounts of time working on these evaluations, and only to come to find that someone else could read it and be like, well, they didn't do it right. That is upsetting. It's really upsetting. So I was like, I need to get into this bilingual extension program. I need options right now. I need to know how to assess these children properly so that we're not wasting time, that we're not wasting taxpayer dollars in our schools, so that we're not wasting time for these children by giving them labels they don't need, or heaven forbid, not giving a label that they need, right? So some of the things that they had, and especially in the textbook as well, the first thing is you gather information on language exposure and use. You gotta know how much exposure they're at, and even ask the parents, like, is it 60-40? Like, are they exposed to Spanish like 60% of the time in the home, 40%? Like, who is speaking to them in each language? Who is it? And then figure it out also in the school. Parent interview, teacher interview. Be aware of the background culture of the student and their social language expectations. I work with preschoolers who come through who aren't saying anything, and the teachers are all like, she needs speech, oh my gosh. It always happens. And I'm like, you guys, literally, what's their family life like? Some cultures, they want children to be seen and play and whatever, but not heard. They're not expected to communicate with adults. Do you really think that when you call on them in circle time, they're going to answer your question when that's not something they've ever been exposed to in the home? Not really. Figure it out. Get a feel for how they are. Get a feel for their language use. Know where you're coming from when you're assessing this kid. Sometimes we only have 1 day with them, 2 hours tops, and you're going to make a decision for this child's next 3 years with eligibility. That is a tough call, right? So interview the parents, interview the teachers, figure out their language exposure, and obtain speech and language information in both languages. Again, with the assumptions, sometimes we make assumptions and we're like, well, so-and-so only uses English when they're speaking with me, which is awesome. That's their language preference, but that's not all of their language ability. So if I just went and gave them an English test, they would not ever be able to utilize the Spanish that they may know that would show that they're age appropriate in language. And they may be limited in their English language knowledge because they haven't been exposed to it for that long. So be careful when you consider tests for kids. Think about the norm referenced assessments that have these norming cases, like what the test is designed for certain kids. They used certain kids to create this test and create the standardized scores that you're going to be using in your reports. So if the norming population doesn't include a bilingual child or your child that you're testing, that test is not for you. Interpret those scores with caution, or don't use the scores at all. Just use that as like, hey, they did well in this area, they didn't do well in this area. As the language specialist, which we all are as SLPs, we know what's right. We know what's right for their age. We know what's kind of off for their age. We can figure it out. We don't need a standard score to tell us that. This will really help us prevent over-identification. If you're giving an all English test to a kid who speaks English and Spanish, they're probably going to get a lower score than all of those English kids who have only been exposed to one language for their entire days. Then we're going to give a kid special education services for what? I don't really know. Their time is going to be taken away from their typical peers, all of those things. It's a snowball, not to mention taxpayer dollars, treating a child that doesn't need to be treated. They just need to have more exposure to English. Such a shame. When you're using those monolingual English tests, because like I said, we don't have very many bilingual assessments, and it's really easy to just grab what you have and what you know. Think about it. This was the red flag. If anybody's out there that's watching that is a bilingual SLP, this stopped me in my tracks. Use of monolingual English norm reference diagnostic measures is invalid, according to Paradis 2005. Paradis, I'm sorry, the textbook has Paradis in it. All of these research articles from since when I was in grad school talking about anything bilingual, Paradis is on there. Paradis is telling me those are invalid. I need to listen, because that person has been doing research for years on bilingual students. So using those tests is invalid, friends. Use and translation of those English-based assessments into the child's first language. So in my case, using an English-based assessment and then informally translating to Spanish to see how they did is, quote, not good practice, end quote. And use of the subsequent scores, if you're actually reporting scores, is, quote, completely invalid. So frustrating. So that's kind of what we're dealing with now, is like, okay, so we can't use those, but what do we use, right? And that's, thank goodness, where this Bilingual Extension Institute has given us some options, which I'm going to discuss in a minute here. So let me see, oh, there was that delayed picture. So here's some bilingual assessment tools that we have, okay? SLAM cards, school age language assessment measures, SLAM, or SLAM cards. They actually have it on the Leaders Project website. I am so thankful for my friend and colleague who introduced me to the Leaders Project website over the winter, right in that December, January timeframe, because she opened my eyes. She was like, let's see, we can use the SLAM cards. And I'm like, yeah, right. But I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, we can. We can get a lot of information from students based on their own narratives, right? So the SLAM cards are something through the Leaders Project that Dr. Kate Crowley had created with another Dr. Bigori, and they really were looking into how can we get information from students that is unbiased, right? So that doesn't, require prior knowledge to perform. That's also going to allow them to show their language abilities that we as the language specialists can assess in the time it takes to do any other standardized tests that won't even yield the right results, which is so annoying. So the SLAM cards are amazing. We can assess their receptive language, we can assess their expressive language, and sneakily can assess their pragmatic language or their use of language or social communication with others as they're working with the clinician. You can use this with preschool, you can use it with school age kids. I've done both. It's amazing. You can develop a series of cards using different languages. They actually have on their website, they have cards specific for children from Jamaica, which is super cool. So like just figuring out different, even dialects of English and coming up with cards that are appropriate for that, culturally appropriate. They have it in Russian, they have it in Chinese and Korean, in African dialects, which is super cool. So they've really taken the time for these SLAM cards, and these are available to us for free. I love things that are free. It's free. You can print it off, you can laminate it, you can use boom cards if you have access to the internet in your school. And what you basically are doing is you're having the child first sequence the events of the cards, right? There's like 7 or 8 cards. It's obviously a story that has a flow. They figure out how to sequence it. Then you can kind of have an understanding of their ability to figure out a story, right? Then the child tells you the story in their own words. And then you flip over, like the back of the cards has like a bunch of different questions on it. So then they answer questions about the story, right? So then you're assessing their receptive language, but then you're also assessing whether they can comprehend what you've said and spit out a response, which is amazing. Gives you a lot of information about a child's standing, but also their academic ability as well. And then the last thing that you kind of are looking at is like, can they connect to the story as it's been told with a personal experience, or can they connect with the story, or can they connect with the main character? And that kind of gives you that theory of mind. Do they have an understanding of other people, other people's preferences? Do they have an understanding of how to problem solve, how to get out of situations, what they could do in certain situations? It's a lot of like real life good information that you can get from these. And again, it doesn't even take any more time than any of those standardized assessments that don't give you anything good, which is amazing. The picture up on top is the subway picture, and it's just one picture, and you just hand it to the kids and you're like, hey, what happened? How did this happen? Did this ever happen to you? What would you do if this happened to you? And you're really eliciting a lot of language. And again, like, because Teachers College Columbia is in Manhattan, subway is appropriate. But for me, I'm like, hey, this is an elevator door, or this is a bus, the door on the bus, and it got stuck on this guy's foot. Oh my gosh. And then I go from there. So I kind of like put it into the context of what my students have been exposed to prior, and go from there. And then down below is a picture. And again, like, if you have access to the PowerPoint or to the PDF, which I'm hoping that you will after this, you can click on these and go straight to the site. And this will take you to the Doggy Comes Home slam cards, which is super cool because it starts off with this girl. This is the first picture. She sees this dog that's black under a porch. It's cowering away. Then she starts playing with it. Then she gets all dirty and gross. And then she's like, oh, right. My mom said I can't bring the dog home. What am I going to do? Then she puts the dog in her book bag. She's on her way in the house. Mom sees her and says, get in the bath. Has no idea why she's so dirty. The girl gets in the bath. The dog goes in the bath with her. And by the end of the story, the dog is actually white. So there's a bunch of language that can be elicited from these cards, and a lot of questions that can be asked by the clinician and answered by the student to get a feel for their understanding of this. So I encourage you to use that. So SLAM is like the biggest thing for me at this point. Time saving and pretty accurate. Another assessment tool that they talked about us using, which I actually have used as well, and I think it's amazing in terms of literacy, eventual literacy, and also speech sound production, which I do appreciate. It's the non-word repetition tasks, NWRT. It sounds kind of weird. We're making kids literally say or repeat these nonsense words that we've made up that actually follow the speech sounds and consonants and vowels in the appropriate locations of word, appropriate positions of words, that doesn't require a child to have prior knowledge of the vocab to be able to get it right. So a lot of our vocabulary tests that we have, or articulation tests, are like, okay, name this, but then if they can't name the word, they get dinged, right? Meanwhile, that's all based on exposure. And the perfect example that I have of this was a dear friend of mine who told me that she had to do an assessment. And the question that came up was, what is this? And it was a picture of a back deck on a house. And the child was supposed to say deck. And that's what they were being assessed on, is, were they able to come up with deck? How did they say the word deck? Well, in the city of Wilmington, I'm sorry, nobody has a back deck. You know what I mean? Like, you're lucky if they live in a house. And so, that was a situation where it was very biased. It was like the expectation was for the child to know that. And if they didn't know that, they got it wrong. But that's really an exposure issue. But whereas these non-word repetition tasks, they don't have to have that background knowledge. It's totally unbiased. This is taking the child as they are, and they're repeating these words back to you, and you're assessing their working memory, their short-term memory, their attention to the task. You're seeing if their phonological awareness. Well, guess what? Some of these go up to 4 syllables. This one is ve ta chai doip. Well, that's 4 syllables long. Can they process every single speech sound that you just said within a 4-syllable, pretty complex nonsense word, basically? And that kind of gives some insight into, okay, do they have knowledge of these speech sounds? Okay. Will they be able to learn words quickly? Okay. Will they be able to pronounce these words appropriately? And then you think, well, if they're struggling with this, they may actually struggle with literacy later on. That's a huge issue. Then you kind of look at it, well, what's their speech sound production? Were they able to do that for you? Were they able to produce all of these speech sounds? There's a lot to be seen in here. And then, of course, we're dealing with bilingual children. And if they can't really do this, they may struggle actually learning another language. And so these are some of the items that we need to look at with these non-word repetition tasks. It gives us way more information than you'd ever imagine in terms of their ability to learn, and kind of gives you an indication of whether there is some language impairment or if they have typical language skills. Down below, it does say that as you're going through all of these words from Dolligan and Campbell, if their total percent of consonants correct is less than 70%, that indicates language impairment. If their percent of consonants correct is over 81%, then that kind of shows typical language skills. So that's just kind of a gauge when you're using this, but it's really quick and easy to administer and gives you a lot of information on the child's abilities. Now over here where it says Español, that is a whole nother list of words. It's very similar to this, but goes all the way to 5 syllables, because in Spanish there's a lot more multisyllabic words. And it follows the speech sounds that are found within Spanish, and you can use that along the way as well to assess both languages and see how they do in both. So this is another excellent example of an assessment tool that is not standardized and not biased, that we can use to really help with the eligibility and classification of our students. There's a video too of Kate Crowley that just came up down here, where she's actually administering these tests. And this is all stuff that can be found on the Leaders Project website. And so you'll have the example of how to do it. And from this presentation, I'm giving you exactly the words here, and also the criteria for what is considered language impairment and not. Another tool that they talk to us about, which I find to be really helpful for preschool, maybe not so much adults, I can't imagine them wanting to sit through this, but it's a dynamic assessment. And obviously dynamic assessment is something that we would like to see happening more than standardized assessment. This is where you're teaching, right? You're assessing their ability, then you're teaching them the ability, and then you're going to assess them again after. Were they able to learn, right? Were they able to learn from what you said? Do they learn quickly? Does it take a lot longer? These are amazing ways for you to have an understanding of their academic abilities moving forward, especially since many of us are school-based, right? So this is considered the FAST mapping. It identifies language impairment in bilingual children. It's almost like a good screener for kids, like initial referrals. It's completely unbiased. It's a dynamic assessment of both receptive and expressive language. It looks at your working memory as well in your language acquisition. And what it is you're teaching 2 completely nonsense words, okay? So the words are koob and tode. And I have over here a picture of like random food items. This is what I love with the preschoolers, is just like, I'm just going to go to the Head Start kitchen area and the dynamic, the dramatic play area, open up the fridge, grab some stuff, right? There's always an item or 2 in there that you don't even know what it is, right? Like sometimes you're just like, what even is this food item and why did they include it in this? So it's hilarious. You grab those. So here we have an example of spaghetti, pizza, I don't know what. And then another thing is like, I don't really know what, but maybe some tomatoes. I'm not sure. So I go ahead and I label them for the child. Oh, look, spaghetti, pizza, koob, tode, and cake, right? Or whatever, pie. I don't know what you want to say. So I go ahead and I label them and I take notes exactly what I said. And that's what I'm teaching the child, right? So I'm teaching them what these words are. And then I'm going ahead and being like, okay, here's my basket. Now we're gonna, I want you to put the items on the table. So go ahead and grab the spaghetti and they'll take it from the basket and put it on the plate on the table. And then like, okay, now grab the cube and see if they remember what I taught them and grab the item. And so that's their ability to receptively identify, like they're hearing what I'm saying, and now they're able to identify that object and pull it out. When you're all done with that and you've gone over the cube and toade, see how they do receptively with that. Then you move along and you're like, oh, it's your turn to be the teacher. You're going to be the teacher, and you're going to, you're going to have the stuff in the basket, and you're going to tell me which ones to grab out of the basket. Now we're switching it over to where they have to expressively label the items, and you want to see how they do. If they do well with that, that's awesome. That means that they learn language pretty quickly, that they learn new vocabulary pretty quickly. If they don't do well on that, that's an indication that they're a little bit slower in the area, that learning new academic language, learning new language at all, is going to be difficult for them academically, and that they may need some assistance. Yeah. So let's see. Yep, I touched on everything there. So that's the FAST mapping. So those are 3 different assessment tools that they kind of taught us. And I'm like, you know what? That just takes the cake. I need to just do these items, and I can get all of the information that any standardized assessment could give me that doesn't even give me the good scores. So this is amazing, and I hope that you can also use these when you're moving forward. So now for the bilingual intervention considerations, which I wasn't too concerned with. I mean, I've been a bilingual SLP for 8 years, and you figure out how to do therapy with kids, and keeping in mind some of the shared sounds and, the language difference and things like that. And you make your goals according to that, and you work on your therapy that way. So this is a little bit quicker than the assessment part, but for the intervention, I thought this was really cool. A research article from Simón Cereijido from 2015 showed that roughly 1/3 of Head Start students and a quarter or a fourth of all youths are dual language learners. So when I say we need more qualified bilingual SLPs, I am looking at you, because we really do need help in this field. There are a lot of students that are dual language learners that considering that there's only 8% of the entire ASHA membership that is bilingual in total, that's pretty wild. We're never going to hit on the quantity of students that need assistance in a bilingual format. The second bullet here, there's no research-based evidence that shows that bilingualism worsens a language disorder. So when you're in your IEP meetings or your eligibility meetings, and parents and teachers are saying that, no, my child's going to be confused, there's absolutely no research that shows that your child is going to be worse off with a language disorder just because they're bilingual. Not the case. We need more bilingual SLPs. I keep throwing it in there. Bilingual interventions do not delay English language acquisition. And that's one of the biggest things that I get asked. We're in the United States. Why are you doing this? Why do you provide your services in, a bilingual format? Well, because it does right, but you're doing right by your kids. It promotes home language maintenance, which is really important, and it doesn't impact their ability to learn English. So why wouldn't we do this? It improves your family relationships at home because you're maintaining that first language, that home language. It ensures the continued quality and quantity of home language exposure that kids need to actually maintain their level of bilingualism, and not just have that subtractive bilingualism where they end up being just monolingual English after a while. It's really important to maintain that home language. And also, English may be the language of the school. This was something that my Teachers College Columbia mentor told me, because I came to her and I said, hey, I've got a student who's very severe. Actually, it's my CF. I'm a supervisor for a clinical fellow. And I was like, she is at the end of her caseload. She cannot take on more kids. We have a student that is so severe and is actually nonverbal. Like, what is your take on having him work with a monolingual therapist at this point, considering that there's no language? There's no language, right? And that's a very conservative view. I'll be honest with you. I'm one of the more conservative bilingual SLPs out there. And I was like, what is your take on this? Give me some reasons to back off that. Give me some reasons. And she said, she's like, English can be the language of your school, and that's awesome. But it doesn't mean that our dual language learners, that they don't also need to communicate with their mommies. And I was like, oh, what are you, I'm a school-based SLP. I don't, and then I was thinking about it and I'm like, oh my gosh, to this day, I'm 35. To this day, I rely on my mom a lot. I need to be able to tell her when I'm not well. I need to be able to tell her when I need help. I need to be able to tell her when I've done something really great. I need to be able to communicate with her. And when you have these children who end up only being taught in the language of the school and not have any ability to communicate with their parents at home, like, for example, if they're at the doctor's office, like not being able to have that connection, it just breaks my heart to think of that. And I was like, way to go, Lorena Diaz, for telling me about that and reminding me why we do the things that we do. Bilingualism is such a gift. Why would we strip that from children when we can give it to them? We just need more bilingual SLPs. So instruction should be meaningful with culturally appropriate context. That's also something that Simon Serigilo had said. A lot of shared book reading. This is so cool. And actually, my employer was really into this. And then a good friend of mine who was his CF at the time was like, hey, the shared reading, like you connect with these kids so well. It's perfect for language. It's perfect for receptively getting language and expressively practicing your language. It's amazing. So shared book readings, and you want to look for books that include, the kid, include the color of their skin, include the kind of culture that they're from. If it's an urban environment, includes urban environments in the books and things like that. Consider working on vocabulary that's not just nouns. How often are we like, what's this? House. What's this? Book. What's this? Meanwhile, trying to put a sentence together, we know from talking about the influence of second languages onto influence of first languages onto the second language, things like SVO, word order, are important. Well, what is the basis? What's the basic part of a sentence? It's a subject, a verb, and an object. If you only know objects, man, you're not going to get very far. Water. I love this. When my students tell me, they're like, water. And I'm like, cool. And then they're like, no, water. And I'm like, what? Do you want water? Do you see water? What is it? And then they're like, want water. I'm like, yes, we just requested it. We have to teach them verbs. We have to teach them how to create these sentences. It can't just be nouns. We have to teach them all the parts of sentences so that later on they can build it up together. You may want to do some, for our younger students like preschool, do some like circle time push in. And that way you're pushing into the classroom, you're providing models, not only just to your student, but also to the staff that's working there, because you're really not guaranteed a lot of credentialed teachers in the areas that you're working in. Especially for me, I have a lot of Head Starts, and they don't really know how to work with students who have IEPs or special needs. So that's a great way for not only for you to work with your students to teach their typical peers how to help your student, but also the staff as well. You could do small group push in or pull out with peers. That's great. Peer models are amazing. They model expressive language and they model how to be social. A lot of our students are delayed or disordered and they don't have these abilities yet. Let's use some of the free resources. Again, free, I love that word. Free resources that are around you to help this child out. Go through morphosyntax elements, right? Grammar and morphology. Go through the ones that are more difficult for the dual language learners to perform or do in English, right? Third person singular S, past tense ED on verbs. Like, these are some things that we can target specifically for students that generally will have trouble with those when they're learning English. Acknowledge, of course, any participation the student has in either of their language or in every language, right? And then, of course, with the school considerations, there are some considerations that your community may have. We're really lucky in the Wilmington, Delaware area to have some dual language programs, but a lot of them are just monolingual English schools, right? So if you have a dual language program, talk to your families about it. Make it a consideration. What are the opportunities for exposure in a student's day? What are the families, what's the family's preference? What do they want for their child? Do they want the child to continue to be bilingual? Is that something of importance to them? Is that something that's truly connected with their identity and that communication? And is that ability to speak to, close family members or distant family members, is that of importance to them? It may not be. You want to chat with them, see if bilingualism is really the route that they want to take. In the meantime, for the therapies, we're going to hit both so that they can make a lot of progress. But those dual language school considerations are actually something that the family has to kind of make. To close things out, I kind of wanted to go through and read this quote to you guys that I thought was pretty cool, supporting bilingualism. And it reads, "Instead of demonstrating that bilingualism impedes language acquisition under conditions of impairment, the children in this study, which was a parodies study, showed that they had the ability to learn 2 languages despite their impairment." So no matter what, the children were able to learn and be bilingual. So that's amazing. So again, I hope that you consider, oh, here's my references, you'll get that. But I really hope that this hits you at a time where you can consider if this is the path that you want to take. You are really needed at this point. We need more bilingual speech language pathologists. Being a speech language pathologist at all is amazing. And I'm so happy that you guys are thinking about it or already in a program. But if you can add on that bilingual piece, you will be doing the community and the future of this nation a great service. So thank you so much for your attention. Reach out if ever. The email is there. My phone number as well. You can send me text messages. You can call me up, and I'm definitely here for you. Thank you so much for attending. I'll see you. Bye.